Hello, dear listeners. Before we begin today's story, I want to send a very special hug to three amazing people who left such lovely comments. Jenny Haverly from Johannesburg, South Africa, Nancy Sawyer from Warrensburg, New York, and Mary Hughes from Bakersfield, California. It's truly a joy to have you here. Knowing our stories are reaching so many corners of the world is just heartwarming. And what about you, dear listener? Tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I love knowing where you all are from. And who knows, maybe your name will be featured in the next video too. Now then, let's begin today's story. The first sound of Kate Reynolds' new life was a pathetic sputter, a cough, a gasp, and then silence. The engine of her beat-up 20-year-old sedan died, leaving her stranded on the shoulder of a quiet country road. Through the heat shimmering off the hood, she could just make out a weathered wooden sign in the distance. Welcome to Franklin, Tennessee. She was miles from her destination, and her fresh start was already broken. With a cry of pure frustration, she slammed her palms against the steering wheel. The impact did nothing but send a stinging vibration up her arms. It felt like a cruel joke from the universe. Just 1 week ago, she'd had a life, or at least the semblance of one. An apartment in the city, a soul-crushing but steady job at a call center. Now, she had nothing. Fired due to corporate restructuring, served with an eviction notice she couldn't fight, she was packing the meager remains of her life into this rust bucket on a desperate pilgrimage to her grandparents' house, her last refuge. Tears of frustration pricked her eyes. She tried her phone. No signal. Of course. She was well and truly stuck, a castaway on an island of asphalt and failure. She was about to drop her head to the steering wheel and give in to the overwhelming despair when the crunch of gravel sounded behind her. An old, dusty pickup truck, the color of a faded blue sky, had pulled over. A man swung out of the driver's side. He wore worn-in jeans that hugged his frame, a plain gray t-shirt stained with grease, and a pair of sturdy work boots. A light stubble shadowed a strong jawline, and as he approached, he pushed a stray lock of dark hair from his forehead, revealing eyes the color of warm whiskey. "Looks like you're having a rougher welcome to Franklin than most," he said, his voice a low, calm rumble. He offered a small, kind smile that seemed to instantly soothe the frantic edges of her panic. "You could say that," she replied, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Let's have a look," he said, not waiting for permission. He moved with a quiet, easy confidence. He leaned under the hood, his hands moving with a practiced, knowledgeable grace. She watched the muscles in his forearms flex as he tinkered with the engine. He didn't treat her like an inconvenience or a damsel in distress. He just worked, a focused calm radiating from him. Within minutes, he had coaxed the engine back to life, albeit with a rough, unhealthy-sounding cough. "It's not a permanent fix," he said, wiping his greasy hands on a rag he pulled from his back pocket. "But it should get you into town. I'm Trav, by the way. I'm a mechanic over at Dale's garage." "Kate," she said, a wave of genuine gratitude washing over her. "Thank you. You're a lifesaver." "Just being neighborly," he replied. "Where are you headed?" It turned out her grandparents' house was just a few blocks from his workshop. He insisted on following her in his truck. "Just to make sure she makes it," he said. The gesture was so simple, so unexpectedly thoughtful, it made her heart ache a little. When she finally pulled into the driveway of the small, welcoming house, he stopped his truck at the curb. He got out, walking over to her window as she cut the sputtering engine. He leaned down, his gaze holding hers. The setting sun caught in his eyes, making them glow. There was an intensity there, a depth that went far beyond that of a simple country mechanic. It was a look that made her feel seen, truly seen, for the first time in a very long time. "Welcome to Franklin, Kate," he said, his voice soft. "I hope the town treats you better than your car did." He gave her one last small smile, then turned and walked back to his truck, leaving her sitting in the sudden silence. Her new life had started with a breakdown, But as she watched him drive away, she felt a strange, unfamiliar flutter of hope. For the first time, she was profoundly grateful that her car had broken down. The next morning, Kate found Dale's garage tucked away on a quiet side street. It wasn't a sleek, modern auto shop. It was an old, cavernous barn of a building that smelled of oil, metal, and honest work. The sound of a wrench clanking against steel echoed from within. She found him underneath a classic 1967 Ford Mustang, the iconic body of the car raised on a lift. He was completely absorbed, his brow furrowed in concentration, his arms covered in a fresh layer of grease. The sight of him so focused, so passionate about the intricate mechanics of the machine, was unexpectedly and powerfully attractive. He wasn't just fixing a car. He was communing with it. "Morning," she said, her voice making him startle slightly. He slid out from under the car on a wheeled creeper and sat up, a grin spreading across his face when he saw her. "Hey there, broken-down stranger. Knew you'd find your way." While he worked on her car, they talked. The conversation was as easy and natural as if they'd known each other for years. She told him about her call center job, the endless parade of angry customers, and the soul-crushing feeling of being a faceless voice on the phone. She confessed her dream of being a writer, of creating worlds with words instead of just repeating a script. He listened, truly listened, asking thoughtful questions. In turn, he spoke of his own past, though in vague, carefully chosen terms. He talked about his passion for classic cars, for the simple, tangible satisfaction of taking something broken and making it whole again with his own two hands. "I got tired of the rat race," he said, tightening a bolt on her engine. "Decided to quit my family's business and do something real for a change." The phrase, family business, was delivered so casually, she pictured a small hardware store or a local construction company. He seemed so genuine, so grounded and completely removed from the world of corporate ambition she had just escaped. He was the most authentic person she had ever met. He charged her a ridiculously low symbolic price for the repair, waving off her protests with a simple, "Welcome to the neighborhood." Just as he was wiping his hands, a phone buzzed quietly from the pocket of his jeans. The ringtone was a discreet, low hum, not the loud chime she would have expected. He pulled it out, his brow furrowing as he glanced at the screen. He turned away from her, taking a few steps toward the back of the garage for privacy. The relaxed, easygoing posture of Trav, the mechanic, vanished, replaced instantly by a subtle, almost imperceptible straightening of his shoulders. A quiet authority settled over him. His voice was low, but in the cavernous quiet of the garage, she caught fragments of the conversation. The tone was what struck her. It was the voice of a man used to giving orders, a voice that expected to be obeyed. "No, postpone the board meeting," he murmured, his back still to her. "I'll handle the Tokyo merger on Monday. My decision is final." He ended the call and stood there for a moment, his shoulders still tense. Then, he took a visible breath, and the tension seemed to melt away. He turned back to her, the relaxed, friendly smile of Trav returning to his face, but it didn't quite reach his eyes this time. There was a shadow there, a flicker of a world she couldn't see. A dozen questions bubbled up in Kate's mind. Board meeting? Tokyo merger? It didn't fit. It didn't make sense. "Tokyo merger?" she asked, trying to make the question sound light, casual, as if she were only half listening. He met her gaze, and for a fraction of a second she saw a flash of something in his eyes, a flicker of conflict, of a man weighing his words. He broke eye contact, his attention suddenly focused on a stray wrench on the workbench. "My family has business," he said, his voice dropping to that same low, serious tone she'd overheard. "It's complicated. I try to stay out of it, but sometimes they pull me back in." He offered no more. He picked up the wrench, his focus now entirely on the tool in his hand, leaving a dense, heavy silence hanging between them in the oil-scented air. It was a clear, unspoken signal. Do not ask more. Kate didn't push. But as she drove away from the garage, her car running smoother than it had in years, a a seed of curiosity had been planted. It was a seed that had a name: the mysterious, complicated family of Travis Davis. A week later, Travis found Kate on her grandparents' front porch, staring at her laptop screen with a look of pure, unadulterated frustration. A single lonely paragraph sat in the middle of a blank white page. "Writer's block?" he asked, leaning against the porch railing with a knowing smile. "It's more like a writer's fortress," she sighed, closing the laptop with a snap. "I can't get past the wall. Every idea I have feels stale and recycled." "You're still thinking in city terms," he said, his eyes twinkling. "Too much concrete in your head. Come on, I'm going to show you how life works in Franklin." He didn't take her to a local landmark or a quaint cafe. He drove his old pickup truck down a series of winding dirt roads until they arrived at a sprawling ranch owned by a friend of his. The air smelled of hay, earth, and the sweet scent of wildflowers. The afternoon became a charming, hilarious montage of Kate's country education. Travis, with a patience that was both amusing and incredibly endearing, taught her how to approach a horse without spooking it, how to hold the reins, and how to gently guide the massive, gentle creature on a slow walk around the pasture. He stood close behind her, his hands briefly covering hers on the reins to adjust her grip. The accidental brush of his fingers against hers sent a jolt of warmth through her that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. His voice was a low, steady murmur in her ear, and she was acutely aware of his solid presence at her back. Later, he dared her to try milking a cow. The attempt ended, predictably, in disaster, with her managing to spray a stream of warm milk directly onto his t-shirt. The initial shock on his face quickly dissolved into a deep, rumbling laugh, a sound so genuine and infectious that she couldn't help but join in, their shared laughter echoing across the open fields. In that moment, surrounded by the simple, earthy reality of the farm, the last vestiges of her city stress seemed to melt away. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, golden shadows across the land, they sat on the worn wooden steps of the ranch's main house, sipping cold lemonade. A comfortable, peaceful silence settled between them. "I can't remember the last time I felt so light," she admitted, her voice soft. "So present." "Me neither," he replied, his voice equally quiet. He turned to look at her, his expression serious, the earlier playfulness gone. The fading light caught in his whiskey-colored eyes, and the easy camaraderie of the day deepened into something else, something more intense. The air grew thick with unspoken words. He shifted closer, the heat from his body a tangible presence beside her. She watched, her heart starting to beat a little faster as he slowly leaned in. His gaze dropped to her lips, a clear, unmistakable signal. This was it, the perfect moment, born from a day of laughter and genuine connection. Her own lips parted slightly in anticipation, but then, just a breath away from her, he stopped. A flicker of conflict, of inner turmoil crossed his face. The weight of his secret, of the world he was hiding from, slammed down like an invisible wall between them. With a visible effort, he altered his course. Instead of meeting her lips, he pressed a soft, gentle kiss to her forehead. The gesture was achingly sweet, but it was a retreat, a denial of what they both so clearly wanted. He pulled back, his smile a little sad. "It's getting late," he said, his voice strained. Kate was left confused, a swirl of disappointment and questions clouding the perfect day. She had felt the shift, the magnetic pull between them, and she had felt his sudden, inexplicable withdrawal. There was a barrier around him, something she couldn't see or name, and for the first time, it made her feel shut out. Travis, meanwhile, walked back to his truck, silently cursing himself. He had wanted to kiss her more than anything. But in that last second, the lie he was living had felt like a poison on his lips. How could he offer her a real kiss when he wasn't being real with her? The simple life he craved was becoming more complicated every day. The illness came on suddenly, a thief in the night. Kate woke in the dark, a deep, shuddering chill racking her body despite the warm Tennessee air. Her head throbbed with a dull, relentless ache, and every muscle felt like it was made of lead. The flu. It hit her with a brutal, unforgiving force, leaving her weak, feverish, and barely able to lift her head from the pillow. She tried to soldier through it, not wanting to worry her elderly grandparents. She stumbled to the kitchen for water, her body trembling, but the effort left her so dizzy she had to grip the counter to keep from collapsing. Defeated, she retreated to her bed, surrendering to the waves of fever and chills. 2 days passed. Travis had texted, but her replies were brief and delayed. An unfamiliar worry began to gnaw at him. It wasn't like her. On the third morning, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong, he drove over to her grandparents' house under the pretense of returning a book he'd borrowed. Her grandmother met him at the door, her face etched with concern. "She's not been herself, Travis. Won't eat, barely gets out of bed. She's burning up." Without a second thought, he stepped inside. "Let me see her." He found her buried under a pile of quilts, her face pale and slick with sweat, her breathing shallow. He gently placed the back of his hand against her forehead. She was radiating heat. The mechanic, the man of grease and steel, vanished. In his place was a man of quiet, focused competence. He spoke with her grandparents, his voice calm and reassuring, promising them he would take care of everything. He went to the local pharmacy and returned with medicine, electrolyte drinks, and ingredients for soup. He took over the sick room with an efficiency that was both surprising and deeply comforting. He spent the rest of the day by her side. He coaxed her to drink, made sure she took the medicine on schedule, and sat in a chair by her bed, a silent, steady guardian. When she grew restless, he picked up the book she'd been trying to read and began to read aloud, his low, rumbling voice a soothing balm on her frayed nerves. He wasn't just being kind, he was being devoted. That night, the fever peaked. Kate drifted in a disorienting, feverish haze, caught between waking and dreaming. In her delirium, old anxieties surfaced, whispering of failures and abandonment. "Not good enough," she mumbled, her voice a faint, broken whisper as she tossed her head on the pillow. "Everyone always leaves." Travis, who had been keeping vigil in the dimly lit room, heard her. He thought she was dreaming of her ex-boyfriend, of the life and the job she had lost. His heart clenched, with a fierce, protective ache. He leaned forward and gently took her hand, his own large, calloused hand enveloping hers. "You are more than enough, Kate," he whispered, his voice raw with an emotion he made no attempt to hide. He believed she was asleep, that he was speaking into the void of her fever dream, and so the truth came out, pure and unfiltered. "You're everything." He squeezed her hand gently, a silent, powerful promise. "And I'm not going anywhere." In the depths of her fever, floating in the hazy space between consciousness and dream, Kate heard him. The words weren't just sounds, they were anchors. They cut through the fog of her illness and settled deep in her soul, a profound comfort that was more potent than any medicine. They were a promise. But as she drifted back towards sleep, a single persistent question echoed in her mind. Who was this man? This gentle, grease-stained mechanic who cared for her with such fierce devotion and made promises like he had every right in the world to keep them. A few days later, the fever had broken, leaving Kate weak but clear-headed. She was sitting on the front porch swing, wrapped in a quilt, the new sketchbook Travis had given her resting unopened in her lap. She was trying to soak in the gentle afternoon sun when a sleek black sedan purred to a stop down the street. It was the kind of car that didn't belong in Franklin, a silent, expensive predator that screamed big city. A woman emerged from the driver's side. She was impeccably dressed in a tailored pantsuit, her posture radiating an aura of power and barely concealed stress. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, her gaze fixed on the simple, rustic sign of Dale's Garage across the street. Her expression was a complex mixture of disapproval, sadness, and weary resignation. After a moment's hesitation, she squared her shoulders and walked purposefully into the workshop. Kate's curiosity was piqued. It wasn't simple nosiness. It was a genuine, protective concern for Trav. That woman was not a customer. She didn't fit. On a sudden impulse, Kate stood up. She went inside, poured a cup of coffee into a travel mug, and headed across the street. It was the perfect, friendly pretext. Just bringing a coffee to the guy who took care of me. As she neared the large, open bay door of the garage, she heard voices from within. They were raised, not in a shout, but with the sharp, strained edge of a serious argument. She stopped instinctively just outside the entrance, hidden from view, not wanting to interrupt what was clearly a private and deeply personal confrontation. The woman's voice, Helen's she would later learn, was firm, but frayed with exhaustion. "I can't do this anymore, Travis. The board is pressuring me for a stock sale your father would have despised. The Singapore team is threatening to strike if they don't get clear leadership. And I'm tired. I spend my nights staring at your father's portrait, asking what he would do, and the only answer I ever get is, 'Where is my son?'" Travis's voice, when he replied, was tense, tight, almost unrecognizable. "Mother, I asked for time, 6 months. That was the agreement." "Time for what?" Helen's voice cracked, the sound of a heart breaking. "To hide here, covered in grease, while the empire he gave his life to build starts to crumble? He missed your baseball games, your birthdays. He worked himself into an early grave to give you a legacy, Travis, not a cage you could just run away from. I'm not asking you to be him. I'm asking you to honor his sacrifice, take your place." There was a heavy, weighted silence. Then Travis spoke again, his voice lower now, laced with a pain that was raw and deep. "And what if his place isn't mine? I spend my days in here, Mom, and for the first time since he died, I feel like I'm building something real, something I can touch. I need this. I need to know that I'm more than just a surname on a shareholder report." Kate backed away slowly, the coffee mug forgotten in her hand, her heart hammering against her ribs. The words echoed in her mind, each one a piece of a puzzle she had never known existed. Board, shareholders, empire, legacy. This wasn't just a family with complicated business. This was a dynasty. The kind, simple man who had taught her how to ride a horse, who had read to her while she was sick, who seemed so perfectly at home in his modest, grease-stained world. It was all a disguise, a beautifully crafted, utterly convincing lie. He wasn't just a mechanic seeking peace. He was a king in hiding. And she, completely unaware, had fallen in love with the pauper's costume. That evening, the setting sun bled across the sky in bruised shades of orange and purple, mirroring the turmoil in Kate's heart. She sat on the porch swing, hugging her knees to her chest, the world she thought she knew now tilted on an unfamiliar axis. The gentle rhythm of the swing was the only movement in her stunned silence. She heard the slow, hesitant crunch of footsteps on the gravel path. It was Travis. He was no longer covered in grease. He had changed into a clean shirt and jeans, but the change of clothes couldn't hide the conflict in his eyes or the weary weight on his shoulders. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, keeping a respectful distance. "I saw you today," he said, his voice low, direct. "Near the garage, so I guess you know." It wasn't a question. Kate didn't answer, her silence a heavy, expectant blanket. He took it as the invitation it was. He walked slowly up the steps and sat in the wicker chair beside hers, close but not touching. "My father," he began, his voice hoarse, the words seeming to cost him a great deal. "He was a force of nature, built everything from nothing. But the empire, it became the only thing he could see. He measured success in stock prices, in acquisitions, in market share. He loved me, I know he did, but he measured his love by the same ruler. 'You're going to be bigger than me, son,' he'd always say." Travis stared down at his hands, now clean and scrubbed, but they looked alien to him, uncomfortable without their familiar coating of grime. When he died of a heart attack at his desk, I didn't just feel grief. I felt panic. I looked at his life, and all I could see was my own future. A future of profound loneliness, surrounded by people smiling at my bank statement, not at me. I had to know if there was something else. If I was something else. He finally lifted his gaze to meet hers, his eyes raw and vulnerable. Coming to Franklin, working with my hands, it wasn't an escape, Kate. It was a search. I just wanted, for a little while, to be Trav. And then, I met you. And you were the first person in years who looked at me and didn't see a dollar sign. You just saw me. And that felt more real than anything in my entire life. He finished, his confession hanging in the humid evening air. He had prepared for her anger, for tears, for accusations. He was not prepared for her quiet, devastating calm. I understand, Travis, she said, her voice even, but with a clarity that cut deeper than any shout. I really do. I understand why you needed to run, why you needed to find yourself. She paused, and when she looked at him, her eyes were filled with a deep, shimmering hurt. The lie isn't what hurts me. It's the reason for it. You've been here for months. You got to know me. You saw who I am, what I value, and you still didn't trust me. Her words were a quiet indictment, and he had no defense. You kept up the disguise, she continued, because somewhere, deep down, you were still waiting for me to prove you right. You were waiting for me to show my hand, to ask for money, to reveal myself as just another person who wanted something from you. You were testing me. She stood up, her calm posture a stark contrast to the storm in her eyes. You weren't hiding from your world, Travis. You were hiding from me. Her voice finally trembled, just a little. I need some time. I fell in love with a man I thought trusted me as much as I trusted him. And now I don't know who you are. And I'm not sure you know who I am either. She turned and walked into the house, closing the screen door softly behind her. The gentle click was the loudest, most final sound Travis had ever heard. It left him alone on the porch, shattered not by her anger, but by the undeniable, heartbreaking logic of her disappointment. A month passed in a haze of silence and furious creativity. The easy laughter from the garage, the comfortable quiet of evenings on the porch. All of it was gone, replaced by the relentless rhythmic click of keys on a laptop. Kate took her heartbreak and poured it onto the page. The confusion, the hope, the anger, the deep aching disappointment, it all became fuel. She wrote with a feverish, obsessive intensity, channeling every ounce of her emotional turmoil into the story of her protagonist. Finally, one gray afternoon, she typed the last word. The end. She leaned back in her chair, a profound emptiness settling over her. The story was finished, her manuscript complete. But her own life felt like it had stalled on a blank page. With a renewed, if fragile, sense of purpose, she began the daunting task of trying to get her book published. She sent out query letters to agents and small presses, her hopes bundled into digital envelopes. The responses, when they came at all, were a slow, soul-crushing trickle of automated rejections. Thank you for your submission, but it is not the right fit for our list at this time. One agent showed a flicker of interest, but warned her that the traditional publishing route was a marathon, not a sprint. It could take years to find an editor, years to see her book in print. Discouraged, she began researching self-publishing. She quickly learned that to do it right, to have a professionally designed cover, proper editing, and a decent initial print run, would cost thousands of dollars. Money she absolutely did not have. Her dream, so tangible and complete on her laptop screen, felt locked behind a door for which she had no key. One afternoon, as she was scrolling through another list of rejections, an email with an unexpected subject line popped into her inbox. Publishing proposal for your manuscript. Her heart gave a skeptical flutter. She opened it. The email was from a small, prestigious design press in Nashville, renowned for their beautiful, artisanal bookbinding. The message was concise. They had read the synopsis and first chapter of her novel, which she had posted on a local writer's blog, and had been utterly captivated. Then came the part that made her breath catch. They informed her that an anonymous benefactor, a patron of the arts who wished to support emerging local talent, had made a substantial donation to their press. The donation was specifically earmarked to cover the full, end-to-end costs of designing, editing, printing, and distributing a first-run edition of 2,000 copies of her book. The donor's single, emphatic condition was that their name was to be kept in the strictest confidence. They were never, under any circumstances, to be revealed to her. A wave of hot, suffocating humiliation washed over Kate, eclipsing any flicker of joy. There was only one person in her orbit who could and would do this. Travis. He thought he could fix this. Fix her. The only way he knew how. By writing a check. By throwing his immense, invisible weight around. He hadn't understood a single word she'd said. Ignoring the explicit condition of anonymity, her hands shaking with a cold, quiet rage, she printed the email. She didn't want his guilt money. She didn't want his charity. She had wanted his trust. She grabbed her keys and marched out the door, the flimsy piece of paper clutched in her hand like a declaration of war. She was going to make it clear, once and for all, that her dream was not for sale. The bell above the door of the garage chimed, a sharp, lonely sound in the quiet afternoon. Travis was sanding a piece of reclaimed wood, the fine dust coating his arms. He looked up, and a hopeful light sparked in his eyes when he saw her, a light that was instantly extinguished by the thunderous expression on her face. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Her anger was a cold, controlled force. She walked to the workbench and slapped the printed email down between them. "I can't accept this, Travis," she said, her voice low but unwavering. He looked from her face to the paper, a deep line of genuine confusion forming between his brows. "Accept what? Kate, what are you talking about?" "The donation," she said, a knot of frustration tightening in her throat. "The anonymous benefactor for my book. I know it was you. I appreciate the gesture. I really do. But I don't want my dream to be funded by your guilt. I told you I needed to do this myself." The sincerity of his confusion was disarming. He picked up the paper, his eyes scanning the words. She watched his face, saw the moment he understood the implication, and then saw the flicker of hurt in his own eyes. "Kate," he began, his voice filled with an honest, desperate urgency. "I swear to you, on my father's memory, this wasn't me." He let out a short, sad laugh. "If I had known you needed help, I probably would have done exactly this," he admitted, a wry, self-deprecating smile touching his lips. "And I would have gotten it just as wrong. But it wasn't me." Before she could process his denial, the bell chimed again. It was Helen. She had been on her way to visit her son, a tentative step toward mending their own fractured relationship. She stopped in the doorway, her experienced eyes immediately sensing the palpable tension between them. Her gaze fell from Travis's conflicted face to Kate's angry one, and then to the printed email on the workbench. "Ah," she said softly, a look of profound understanding dawning on her face. "It seems my anonymity didn't last very long." Both Travis and Kate turned to stare at her, stunned into silence. "You?" Kate whispered, the single word full of disbelief. "It was me," Helen confirmed, stepping further into the garage. She walked toward them, her expensive shoes making soft sounds on the concrete floor. Her gaze was fixed on Kate, and it was surprisingly gentle. "I read the synopsis of your book," Helen explained, "the one you posted on the Franklin Writers blog. The story of a young woman who leaves her old life behind to find something more authentic, something real." Her gaze shifted, moving from Kate to her own son, who was watching her, utterly astonished. Helen's eyes filled with a sudden shimmering film of tears. That story. It reminded me of my Travis, she said, her voice cracking with emotion. And even more, it reminded me of the man my husband always wished he had the courage to be. She looked back at Kate, her expression a mixture of gratitude and a deep, maternal sadness. I didn't invest in your book because you're the girl my son is in love with, she said. The statement so matter-of-fact, it made both of them flinch. I invested in it because your story gave me hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, my son has finally found someone who understands the part of him that has no price tag. She reached out and gently touched Kate's arm. I wasn't trying to buy your dream, my dear. I was thanking you for showing my son that he was allowed to have his own. The revelation hung in the oil-scented air, a stunning, beautiful truth that recontextualized everything. It wasn't an act of guilt from a billionaire. It was an act of hope from a mother. It was a bridge, not a wall, and it left Kate and Travis standing side by side, united by a gesture of profound depth that neither of them had ever expected. After Helen left, a new kind of silence settled over the workshop. It wasn't the heavy, angry silence of before, nor the awkward silence of strangers. It was a quiet space of reflection, thick with the weight of the revelation that had just unfolded. Kate, still reeling, was the first to speak. Her voice was low, sincere, stripped of all its earlier anger. Travis, I'm sorry, she said, looking at the worn wooden workbench between them. I accused you, unjustly. He shook his head immediately, closing the distance between them until he stood on the other side of the bench. No, Kate, you have nothing to be sorry for. You assumed the logical thing based on the man I showed you I was. This is my fault. He leaned his hands on the bench, his gaze fixed on hers, his vulnerability a raw, open wound. When you said I was testing you, you were right. I didn't see it then, but you were. I was so consumed by my own fear of being used again, so focused on the past, that I couldn't see the incredible, honest person standing right in front of me. His voice dropped, full of a self-awareness that was painful to witness. I wasn't doubting you, Kate. I was doubting that something this good could possibly be real. And that's my failing, not yours. His complete and total ownership of his mistake, his refusal to let her share the blame, disarmed her completely. The last of her anger dissolved, replaced by a wave of empathy. For the first time, she saw past the billionaire and the mechanic, and saw the man, burdened by his own scars. So, she said, her voice a little stronger now, a flicker of a challenge in her eyes as she finally met his gaze. What do we do now? The question was not about the book. It was not about his mother's money. It was about them. He understood the challenge implicit in her words. This wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It was a door, cracked open just enough for him to prove he could be the man she deserved. A slow, genuine smile, the first she had seen in over a month, spread across his face. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated hope. Okay, he agreed, his voice firm. No more secrets, no more half-truths. He paused, his smile turning a little shy, a little nervous. But for that to work, you're going to have to let me take you on a proper first date. For real this time. The proposal hung in the air. It wasn't a grand, sweeping solution. It was something much smaller and much more meaningful. It was a quiet, honest request for a new beginning, a chance to start over, from scratch, with all the cards on the table. The following evening, Kate waited on her grandparents' porch, a nervous flutter in her stomach. She had no idea what to expect. A limousine? A helicopter whisking her away to a 5-star restaurant in Nashville? The possibilities that came with his reality were dizzying. Instead, a familiar welcome sound filled the quiet street. It was the low, throaty rumble of the 1967 Ford Mustang. It pulled up to the curb, but it was transformed. The car, which had once been a work in progress, a symbol of his disguise, was now impeccably restored. Its deep blue paint gleamed under the twilight sky, the chrome polished to a mirror shine. It was no longer just a mechanic's project. It was a masterpiece. It was the first tangible proof that he could merge his two worlds. He got out, not in a suit, but not in his grease-stained work clothes either. He wore dark jeans, a simple, well-fitting black shirt, and the same kind smile he'd had the day her car broke down. He didn't take her to a fancy restaurant. He drove them out of town, up a winding road that led to the top of the highest hill in Franklin County. There, silhouetted against the star-dusted sky, stood an old, abandoned observatory, its dome a dark half-sphere against the heavens. From the trunk of the Mustang, he produced not a catered dinner, but a wicker basket filled with sandwiches from the local diner, a bottle of red wine, and a thick, soft blanket. In the center of the observatory's dusty floor, he had already set up a large, powerful telescope. "My first love," he said with a shy, almost boyish smile, gesturing to the telescope. "Before the cars, before everything else, I wanted to be an astronomer." Under the vast, silent canopy of the Milky Way, far from the demands of his empire and the ghosts of their misunderstandings, he finally opened up. He didn't talk about stock values or corporate strategy. He pointed out the constellations, telling her the stories his father had taught him as a boy before the business had consumed him. He spoke of the profound, crushing loneliness he'd felt after inheriting an empire, a feeling he compared to the cold, empty space between galaxies. He confessed that the garage wasn't just an escape. It was an attempt to reconnect with the few precious memories he had of his father from before the fortune was made. Of the two of them on a Saturday afternoon, covered in grease, working together to fix a lawnmower engine. For the first time, Kate wasn't seeing the billionaire who hid his identity, or the charming mechanic with a secret. She was seeing Travis. A man trying to map his own place in the universe, trying to reconcile the boy who loved stars with the man who inherited the world. As he was speaking, his phone vibrated in his pocket, its screen casting a brief, intrusive glow on his face. Kate caught a glimpse of the caller ID. Marcus Thorne, CFO. Travis glanced at the screen, his story faltering for a second. Kate watched him, her breath held. This was a test, she realized. A real one. He looked from the glowing screen back to her eyes, which were watching him intently in the starlight. Without a moment's hesitation, he reached into his pocket, pressed the button on the side of the phone to decline the call, and silenced the device completely. "They can wait," he said, his voice firm, his focus entirely back on her. The gesture was simple, but its significance was monumental. It was the first time he had consciously, unequivocally chosen her over the demands of his other life. The final, invisible barrier between them seemed to dissolve into the cool, star-filled night. Weeks after their real first date, a new, fragile reality had taken root. Their relationship was a secret garden they tended in the small town of Franklin, a world away from the pressures of his other life. But they both knew it couldn't last forever. One afternoon, Kate watched from the doorway of his bedroom as he packed a sleek leather suitcase. The sight sent a pang of anxiety through her. "Are you sure you have to go back?" she asked softly. He turned, his face etched with a heavy resignation. "I have to," he said, his voice tired. "My mother, the board, my father's legacy. I can't just abandon it all. It's my responsibility." He crossed the room and took her hands, his grip tight. "But this is temporary. I'll find a balance. I promise. I'll fly back every weekend." He returned to New York and stepped back into the role of Travis Davis, the formidable CEO. He was brilliant, decisive, and commanded every room he entered. The business world celebrated the return of its prince. But Kate, watching from afar, saw a different story. In the society pages and business journals online, she saw photos of him at galas and board meetings. He looked exhausted. The light she had seen in his eyes at the observatory was gone, replaced by a familiar, haunted look. The look of his father. The promised weekends began to falter. A board meeting emergency one week, an unexpected crisis in the Asian market the next. The calls became shorter, filled with the weary stress of his corporate life. Kate tried to be understanding. She truly did. But a cold dread was beginning to settle in her heart. The empire he had gone back to honor was consuming him, just as he had always feared. One night, they were on the phone, his voice so strained and distant, it felt like he was calling from another planet, not just another state. "I miss you, Trav," she whispered, the ache in her voice palpable. There was a pause on the other end of the line, filled with the static of a bad connection and a world of regret. "I miss you too, Kate," he finally replied, and the defeat in his voice was like a physical blow. "More than you can possibly imagine." She hung up the phone with a painful, sinking certainty. She was losing him. Not to another woman, but to the ghost of his father, to the relentless, soul-crushing weight of an empire he had never wanted. Late one Tuesday night, Helen Davis let herself into the silent, cavernous executive suite of the Davis Corporation. She found her son exactly where she knew she would, exactly where she had found his father for 35 years. He was hunched over his massive desk, the glow of a laptop screen casting long, tired shadows across his face. He was surrounded by stacks of reports, a lone glass of whiskey sweating beside his hand. He was the perfect image of the king in his lonely castle. "Travis," she whispered from the doorway. For a terrifying, heart-stopping second, the man who looked up was not her son, but her late husband. The same exhaustion, the same haunted look in his eyes. The momentary confusion shook her to her core. He blinked, surprised to see her. "Mother, what are you doing here?" She walked into the room and sat in the leather chair opposite his desk, her expression filled with a deep, profound sadness. "I asked you to come back," she began, her voice quiet but firm. "I asked you to honor your father's legacy, and I was wrong." Travis stared at her, utterly shocked. "What?" "I spent my entire marriage competing with this office," she said, gesturing to the room around them. "I loved your father, but I lost him to this company long before his heart gave out. I would sit at home waiting, while he was here, chasing one more deal, one more zero on the balance sheet." Her eyes filled with tears, tears she had held back for years. "I see you now, and I see the same shadow falling over you. I see you becoming him. And I cannot bear to watch another man I love sacrifice his happiness on this altar of ambition." She reached across the desk and took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Your father built all of this because he was terrified of the poverty he grew up in. He wanted to give us security. But in the end, his greatest fear was that he had only succeeded in building a gilded cage. He told me once, near the end, that his biggest regret was not the deals he lost, but the baseball games he missed." She looked him directly in the eye, her love for him a fierce, protective force. "The greatest legacy you can give your father isn't to run his company into the ground with your own misery. It's to have the courage to be happy. The courage he never found for himself." She squeezed his hand. "Go, my son. Go back to your life. Go back to her." The permission, the blessing from the one person he felt he owed this sacrifice to, was the key that unlocked his cage. He looked at the empire spread out before him, the reports, the global markets, the endless responsibility. Then he looked at the small framed photo he kept on the corner of his desk. It was a picture he had taken of Kate on the ranch, laughing, her face tilted up to the sun. For the first time, the choice was not a conflict. It was a moment of absolute, soul-shattering clarity. He stood up, walked around the desk, and kissed his mother on the forehead. Then, he grabbed his coat, and without a single look back at the empire he was leaving behind, he walked out of the office. The night of her book launch, the small, independent bookstore in downtown Franklin was buzzing with an energy it hadn't seen in years. The entire town, it seemed, had come out to support her. Her grandparents stood in the front row. their faces beaming with a pride so pure it made Kate's heart ache. She stood at a small podium, the finished book, her book, in her hands. It was beautiful, the cover a simple, elegant design, her name printed in clean, confident letters. She was radiant. She spoke about her journey, about second chances, and about the courage it takes to start over. She thanked her family, her new community, and her publisher, never mentioning the anonymous donor, honoring the spirit of the gift. But as she spoke, a quiet melancholy tugged at the edges of her joy. She had emailed Travis about the launch weeks ago. He had replied with a genuinely happy and supportive message, but explained that he had a critical, unavoidable business trip to Tokyo that same week. She understood. She really did. But his absence was a palpable void in the crowded room. As she finished her speech and the applause washed over her, she scanned the crowd one last time. A hopeful habit she couldn't seem to break, searching for a familiar face she knew wouldn't be there. But then she saw him. He was standing at the very back of the bookstore, leaning against a tall shelf of classic literature, partially obscured by the crowd. He wasn't in a suit. He was in his simple jeans and a dark shirt, looking tired, travel-worn, but undeniably there. His eyes were fixed on her, and he was smiling. A real, genuine, unguarded smile that reached all the way to his soul. The world around Kate seemed to slow down, the noise of the crowd fading to a distant hum. Their eyes locked across the room, and in that single silent moment, 1,000 conversations passed between them. Later, as the line for autographs began to dwindle, he made his way toward her. He waited patiently until the last person had gone, then approached the table. "I thought you were on your way to Tokyo," she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs as if she'd just run a marathon. "I was," he replied, his voice low and soft, for her ears only. He stopped just in front of the table, close enough for her to see the exhaustion and the profound relief in his eyes. "I was at the airport, but I realized I was getting on the wrong plane. The only place I needed to be today was here." The simple, profound truth of his words left her breathless. He hadn't just skipped a meeting. He had chosen a destination. He had chosen her. The last of the guests had trickled out, leaving the bookstore in a state of happy, settled quiet. The owner was in the back, counting the register, giving them a bubble of privacy. They stood by the signing table, the air between them thick with all the things that had been left unsaid for weeks. "I saved one for you," Kate said, her voice a little shaky. She reached under the table and pulled out a fresh, crisp copy of her book. "It's the very first one the printer sent me." He took it from her, his hands gentle, holding it as if it were a sacred object. He ran his thumb over her name on the cover, a look of immense pride on his face. "I'm so proud of you, Kate," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he didn't try to hide. He opened the cover to the first page, expecting to see a simple, signed autograph. Instead, he saw her familiar, elegant handwriting filling the blank space. It wasn't a signature. It was a dedication. His eyes scanned the words, and she watched as his breath hitched, his knuckles turning white where he gripped the book. The dedication read, "For Trav, who taught me that home isn't a place you go to, but the feeling of finally being found. This story is ours." The words were a confession, a declaration, and an absolution all in one. It was her entire heart, distilled into 2 perfect sentences. It was everything she had been forbidden from saying, now immortalized in print. "Kate," he whispered, his voice breaking. He looked up from the page, his eyes shimmering with unshed tears. The tough CEO, the stoic mechanic, both had vanished, leaving only a man completely undone by her love. "I have something for you too," he said, his voice hoarse. He reached into the pocket of his jacket, his hand trembling slightly. "I've been carrying this with me since the day I went back to New York. I was just waiting until I had the courage to choose my own life, so I could be worthy of asking you to be in it." He pulled his hand from his pocket. In his palm was not a ring box. It was a small, simple, hexagonal steel nut, a piece of hardware from a car engine. It was clean, but she could see the faint, worn marks on its edges. And then, right there in the quiet, book-filled sanctuary she had created, surrounded by the stories of 1,000 other lives, he got down on one knee. "Kate Reynolds," he began, his voice trembling but clear, his gaze locked on hers. The entire world seemed to shrink until it was just the two of them in the warm, book-scented air of the quiet store. I spent months trying to honor my father's legacy, trying to be the man I thought he wanted me to be. He shook his head, a sad, wise smile on his lips. But it took my mother and your story to make me realize the legacy he truly wanted for me was the one he never got for himself, the chance to be happy. He looked around the bookstore at the tangible result of her dreams. "I don't want to be the CEO who visits you on weekends. I want to be the man who wakes up beside you, who brings you coffee while you write, who gets his hands dirty in the garage in the afternoon, and who gets to read your stories at night. I don't want to balance two worlds anymore, Kate. I want our world to be the only one that matters." He opened his hand, revealing the simple steel nut he held. "My father gave me this when I was 16, after we fixed my first car together. He said, 'Most people will give you shiny things, son, but real value is in the things that hold life together. Don't ever forget that.'" Then, from the same pocket, he pulled out a small velvet box. He opened it. Inside was a stunning, elegant diamond ring. "The diamond is a promise for our future," he said, his eyes shining with tears. "A future of first-class flights and quiet country nights. A future where we build things together." He then gently picked up the steel nut and held it beside the ring. "And this," he whispered, "is a promise for our foundation. A reminder of a mechanic who fell in love with a writer on the side of the road. A reminder to always be the parts that hold each other together." "Kate," he asked, his voice thick with a lifetime of emotion, "will you marry me and build this life with me?" Tears of pure, unadulterated happiness streamed down her face. She knelt on the floor in front of him, so they were at eye level. "Yes," she whispered, her voice choked with laughter and love. "Yes. Forever. Yes." He slid the brilliant diamond ring onto her finger. It shone under the soft lights of the bookstore. They kissed, not as a billionaire and a writer, but as Trav and Kate. The kiss was a perfect fusion of their two worlds, the strength of steel and the brilliance of a diamond, the smell of old books and the promise of a new engine, the quiet country road and the limitless sky. They were finally home, in the story they had chosen, together.